there. As I mentioned,
good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for our another one of our professional development series webinars. Today's session is on economic recovery and resiliency. It's great to have everybody back. We've had great attendance all week for every one of our webinar series, and again, a reminder, we have more next week. I'm talking to you today from the traditional territory of the Selkirk First Nations here in the Okanagan. Happy to be able to work, live, and play on in their territory. Today, my name is Dale Wielden. I'm the President and CEO for the BC Economic Development Association, and also have with us today first speaker Colleen Bond and Amy Reed from Quesnel. Amy will hop onto the call here a little bit into the presentation to talk about what she has been doing in Quesnel. And I also want to mention that Amy is also the current chair of the BC Economic Development Association. So my background in economic development goes back to the early 1990s. And our background in economic recovery and resiliency work goes back to 2012 with the Burns Lake mill explosion, and then we have done disaster recovery work. Not a great thing to really be proud of, but a lot of disaster recovery work here in British Columbia with the wildfires and flooding. We've done it in Alberta following the flooding, and then we've of course done it in Cambodia, Virgin Islands, the United States in different parts of the states, and Saipan. Yeah, it's an important topic that communities really need to make sure that they are prepared. Colleen, what about yourself?
Yeah, I've been in economic development for 25 plus years. I hate to say 30, but it's probably 30, but that sounds like it's really old. 25 seems manageable, you know. But, you know, honestly, when you and I first got into economic development, who would have thought that, you know, more than a third of our focus of those years would be on disaster recovery? And it really has turned out that way. When we started doing that, as you said, back in 2012, maybe even a little earlier, you know, that was just one thing that came up with the up in Burns Lake that was tragic, but we just didn't realize how that economic recovery piece really was going to play a part in economic recovery, and how as economic developers, we really do need to be prepared to help our businesses recover as fast and as quickly as possible, and to make them resilient, so that when a disaster does come, and we're going to talk about that, it's never an if, it's a when a disaster does come, that we're able to help them get back to doing business as quick as possible.
Great. So our next slide, we highlight all of the different webinars that we're hosting over this week and next week. Monday's session is on business retention expansion, and we have Leith Wardy going to be giving us a session on the importance of business retention expansion. And Leith is the instructor for business retention expansion, the main instructor for the International Economic Development Council. So it should be a great presentation on Monday as well. So yeah, as Colleen said, disasters are going to happen, and who would have thought, Colleen, when you mentioned that we wouldn't have thought about a third of our time being spent on disasters, but who would have even thought when we first even started talking disasters that there would have been a global pandemic? And of course there was, and I think if that hasn't woke everybody up to the fact that disasters will happen, and that we need to be better prepared for that, I'm not sure what will. And we've seen disasters happening all over the place in the last few years. Just prior to this call today, I was talking with some folks in Atlantic Canada, and including the minister responsible for rural development, and we were talking about the disaster that will impact Atlantic Canada sometime, I think today, starting today. You know, we need to be better prepared as to how do we recover the economic impacts that happen when in disasters. If you don't focus on those, your businesses aren't going to survive. It's harder for your businesses to overcome the shocks of the loss of business, the loss of their ability to get supplies, the loss of their employees that will be called upon to deal with their own issues. You know, how do we better address those things, and how do we as a community pull together to make sure these businesses recover? It really is important to make sure you're well planned, who in the community, and pulling people together, and of course recognizing that recovery takes time. And we've been, you know, we see, you know, in a lot of cases we'll go into areas, you know, a year to 2 years to 3 years after the disaster to talk about recovery, because that recovery process is still taking place. It does take time. It's not a short-term, there's no short-term fix. Colleen?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely the case. Is no doubt that takes time, and you know, it's just like we were talking in some of the other webinars, Dale, about economic development. It takes time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So you know, think of that. Just doing economic development in regular good times, that takes time, and then put on a disaster on top of that. So yeah, recovery takes an awful long time to get back and get your community back to normal. And you know, sometimes it's really hard to start to, after everything that we've seen over the last number of years, to say back to normal, because I think we're still trying to find out what that actually even means for a lot of us now. So you know, what's the plan about that? And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, is we really want to give you the step-by-step plan of how to get your economy set and ready for when that disaster happens. And here are sort of the 10 steps that we're going to talk about today. And we're not going to, you know, we've only got an hour, so we're going to have to go fairly quickly on these, but we're not going to leave you alone by the end. There's so many resources that BCEDA has put together that that we'll mention throughout the presentation. And I know Ashley's so good at putting things up in the chat when we talk about them. So there's lots of references that we're going to be able to give you to be able to actually write your own plan. That's really the goal of this, is to make sure that you have that plan written and ready to go when you are hit by a disaster. So the first one, we might as well just get right into it, Dale, is the Economic Recovery Task Force.
Yeah, and that task force is really that one that's going to take on that responsibility for the economic recovery of the community. I mean, we're going to have so many other agencies and organizations involved dealing with, you know, like infrastructure, or dealing with the social issues that happen, or making sure people have access to food, the individuals have access to the different resources. This task force is really going to put together that plan to make sure that the businesses and the economic factors of your community have the access to the resources and the information that they need to, you know, throughout that recovery process. And they are different. There is different needs for businesses. You need to make sure that when you're putting together this task force, one of the things, Colleen, we really seen, as much as we talked about the need to establish these task forces, it wasn't until COVID kicked in where all of a sudden you've seen a mad rush of communities rushing to establish these task force, somebody to sort of oversee that the process of working with businesses, and those groups, we seen communities would send us their you know, their terms of reference for their committees, And it would be, you know, consisting of local government officials, regional government officials, maybe provincial government officials, business owners, and other stakeholders. You know, the universities or the colleges, you know, the public utilities that are in the area. You know, chambers of commerce, community futures, etc., might be partly responsible for different aspects of the recovery. It's that task force is doing some communication amongst the task force members themselves, and then of course with the broader community. They're implementing the different aspects of the recovery plan, the plan that you will have written, that will have guided the whole establishment of this task force to begin with. And then, of course, identifying other programs and initiatives that they will undertake to see or to help the communities, the businesses recover from the disaster impacts. The other thing, maybe I just wanted to quickly mention, Colleen, and then hand it over to you, but a lot of the different items in this plan content and will typically be, and we've talked about this in the past, where you know, you have to identify what your risks are, what types of disasters, but that's usually done in the process of developing your emergency response plan. So that kind of work it has typically already been done. It never hurts to allow the task force, this recovery task force, to look at that and see if something maybe has been overlooked. It'd be interesting to know how many of the emergency response plans actually address things like a pandemic. It, you know, so it's something that we, you know, sometimes need to look at these things, you know, collectively and see should there be other changes made.
Yeah, and you know, you touched upon the fact that you're right, with the pandemic, so many communities were putting together these task forces as they went along, sort of thing, and that's, you know, why we talk about the plan in place before a disaster happens, so that, you know, you've already designated your task force. They know that they are ready to jump into it as soon as a disaster happens. So you're not wasting you know, a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is, to gather this task force together, right? You've already got them put together. They know their responsibilities well before a disaster happens, and they're ready to hit the road. And I think you're right, Dale. We really need to talk about that makeup of making sure that business owners are included in that task force. We're talking about the economic recovery of your community, so they do need to definitely be on your task force, and make sure, like, this is an example. This is one fellow here from Penticton, and they had a really good task force in place. They had, of course, their city representatives, but they also determined, you know, who are their main industries in some ways, right? So they had, you know, representatives from the winery industry. And if you know Penticton at all, wines are huge there. They had a representative from the brewery. Their core downtown centers around brewery. So they realized who are key business owners or targets in their community, and put together a task force around those as well and included them. The next step we want to talk about is having that Center for Economic Recovery, and as the first bullet point says, that's really just a one-stop shop for business. So it's where businesses can go after the disaster has happened to find out what resources are available for them, what type of resources are there for them financially, what about, you know, with labor force, all sorts of different things that impact your businesses after a disaster would be encased in this business recovery or economic recovery center. And what we would encourage you to do in the pre-planning phase as you're building your plan is to determine a location where this center could be in your community. And we would also encourage you to think of alternate locations as well. You don't know exactly what that disaster is going to be. You don't know exactly how that disaster may hit your community. So perhaps you say, you know what, we're just going to have our economic recovery center located at 123 Main Street. Well, maybe unfortunately the flooding happens straight down Main Street and you can't get into 123 Main Street at all. So by having an alternate location, you can move somewhere else and then readily have that set up instead of, again, after the disaster hits, sort of trying to figure it out on the ground. It's so much easier to do these steps pre-planning, and we really, I hate to say it again, but we really encourage you to do this. So you have to think of who's involved, who's going to be responsible for the Economic Recovery Center. Typically, it's going to be the Economic Development Officer is going to be responsible, but it may be the Chamber of Commerce in some communities, it may be Community Futures. It's up to that individual community for sure. You want to make sure that you have resources available, representatives that are available to talk to your businesses in that center, whether they're local, federal, provincial, regional. You want the banks, insurance. And Dale, we could do a whole, hour plus, probably a day just on insurance. If there is one issue that comes up time and time again after disasters for businesses, it's insurance. And it's the lack of insurance that businesses have, because there's generally a misunderstanding of what insurance is available for businesses. There's a lack of understanding of what's needed for insurance from the business side of things. And then even when businesses think they have the insurance that they need, it comes out that the insurance sometimes doesn't pay. And I don't think many of us are too surprised to hear that, but we have heard a lot of really sad stories with businesses that either thought they were insured and weren't, or just didn't have the right type of insurance. So make sure insurances are there. And one thing that I think would be really good, and we talk about this many times, is prior to a disaster, is talk with insurance in your community, talk with the Insurance Bureau of Canada about putting together a session. And I believe, Dale, you can talk about this, but I believe they do it for free, but bringing them into the community, maybe it's a webinar, what have you, to talk to businesses about what insurance means for them, particularly in a disaster. If you can do that before a disaster, you can really help your businesses in a long way. So make sure insurances are there, the workforce agencies, entrepreneurship, figure out how you're going to market and communicate that center. So once the disaster happens, you're ready to say, press release out, or however you're going to communicate it out. Here's where our center is. Come on down. We can help you. We've got the resources there. And maybe you've got to or want to establish a telephone number, a separate toll-free number, whatever it is, what works for your community. Make sure you understand how that all works. And I know it sounds like a lot to do, but the resources that BCEDA has, honestly, there's templates that will walk you all the way through this stuff. We can't make it easier for you, I don't think, Dale.
Yeah, we definitely have tried, and you're right about the insurance, and the insurance. I believe it was Fort St. James recently actually held a session with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, to where they came and they talked about what kind of insurance should you really have in for your business. What types of things should you be asking your insurance bureau brokers, and making sure that you are protected, that you are insured against sort of some of those maybe unexpected things, or maybe even in some cases those expected things, but sometimes are not included in the policies, like flooding or fire, those types of things. Make sure that they're in your policies, and are there ways to get those things added. We've been able to use, and we've used them in Merritt. We used them in Princeton. We've used them in Grand Forks. We used them in the wildfire situations when we were working helping in 2017. And that we work with the Insurance Bureau of Canada. They're very receptive. They'll actually participate in your recovery center if you ask them to. They're a small organization in many ways as well, but they do their best to get involved. And then they will participate, of course, in either webinars or potentially travel to the community to participate in an actual community session. The other thing that I think is really important on and this really came to a head in COVID, Colleen, was having an online center for economic recovery. So not only, in the case of COVID, you couldn't have a physical facility, so you had an online facility. And one of the things that, Ashley does this, I'll give her full credit here. Once a disaster has been declared in British Columbia, and then sometimes even before a disaster has been declared, we'll activate our page for, whether it be wildfires, whether it be floods. And in this case, with COVID, we launched our webpage with resources. Basically, I believe it was a day or maybe 2 days after the World Health Organization declared, as in about a week and a half ahead of when the province where it was officially declared a pandemic in the province and the country. And it's important to have this information up. It was and Ashley prepares this live document that is full of resources as they're announced. It's information from banks, insurance companies, utilities, Hydro Fortis, any, TELUS, Shaw, whatever, for, what kind of supports are being made available to individuals or to businesses to help during those disasters. So it's important to have those types of resources available in your community. One of the things that we do find is communities take a lot of the live document, or will take the live document and put it as a link onto their page as well, so that people can access that information as it comes available. And again, it is live, so it's important to keep this information up to date. And then, of course, we talk about business community engagement. And really, when you're talking disasters and economic recovery, it's really business retention and expansion on steroids. This is your opportunity to engage with your businesses, but it's good to do it also before, so that you have that up-to-date business contact information. Trying to reach those businesses during a disaster is hard if you don't have up-to-date information on those businesses. We've seen that during multiple disasters. And when we talk about reentry later, you'll understand why having up-to-date business information is so essential, and including not just a phone number, but email addresses and other ways of communicating with business owners directly, and to make sure that they're aware of the types of assistance, resources, and maybe even to enter the community early to restock their businesses. You're educating and communicating with businesses during the disaster, and even prior to and after the disaster. You're communicating with these, and we could get into numerous stories, Colleen, about the need to communicate, the need to have contact information, and why, and some real examples of disasters that were made even worse because that information wasn't available. Do a needs assessment. I know that we're going to have Amy Reed talk here shortly, where they went out to their businesses and talked to their businesses and collected information. And there's a lot of communities that have done that. We went into Princeton and Merritt following the flooding, and went in and talked to the businesses. In Grand Forks, we did this. We talked to the businesses after the disaster to say, what were the financial impacts? And I can't remember the millions of dollars that we discovered in Merritt and Princeton off the top of my head, Colleen, but also the workforce hours that were lost. And then this type of information helps establish the programming that maybe the Canadian Red Cross will provide. This actually establish the program for financial resources for Grand Forks businesses, for wildfire businesses in 2017. We used it the Red Cross used it to develop resources for Princeton, Merritt, in the way of business and financial support for businesses that were impacted by the flooding in just last year. So it's important, though, when you're gathering this types of information, is to act on the business's needs. What are their needs for support in the community? It doesn't have to be maybe financial, it can be other things, but you don't know until you're actually engaging with them and talking with them. Colleen, anything else before we hand this over to Amy?
Well, I'm just looking at the time, and I think we better just hand it over to Amy.
Typical, right? Yep.
That's great.
Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here if I can. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay, there we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Amy Reed. I'm the Manager of Economic Development and Tourism with the City of Quesnel. And as Dale said, I'm also the current chair of the British Columbia Economic Development Association Board. And I'm going to talk about our business support team that we put together at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you were at the summit in 2021, you may have seen some of this before, so I apologize if it's repeat information for you. So our team, our economic recovery task force, if you will, was the city, Community Futures, the Chamber of Commerce, our 3 business improvement areas that we have in our community of 10,000 people, the District of Wells, and the Cariboo Regional District. And we pulled this team together very quickly in March of 2020. I will say that we did not have a written business or written economic recovery plan that named this team, but we had definitely worked with this team before and knew who our key players were that we wanted to have on that initial call. So prior to COVID, like I said, we'd worked together. We'd done business walks together in 2014 through 2016. That first business walks in 2014 was following a mill closure in Quesnel, where we pulled together and went out and talked to our businesses then. We also had business liaisons through Community Futures in 2017 and 2018 following wildfires in the Cariboo region, and had worked together then on a wildfire recovery plan. And Community Futures and the Chamber of Commerce and the city had been working together on a longer form business survey in 2019 that we had planned to launch in the spring of 2020 when COVID hit. So in March of 2020, we sent out an invite for a kickoff phone call with all of us working from home. We identified our objective, and I think this was really key, that we had a really clear objective of what we were setting out to do, and that was to maximize the amount of COVID-19 support funding coming into our community. We knew that there were going to be a lot of programs coming out, and we knew that businesses weren't always great at accessing those programs based on the experience we had with wildfires in 2017 and 2018. There was funding from Red Cross at that time, and our business community saw that as, that was charity, that wasn't for them, or that was money for businesses that had burned to the ground. And it wasn't, it was for any business who had been impacted. They weren't great at filling out the forms. They weren't great at figuring out what they were eligible for. And so those business liaisons were key in going out, meeting with businesses and helping walk through that process. With COVID, we couldn't go out and walk through it with them face to face. So we set up a business support hotline. We also knew that businesses weren't great at asking for help, so we had to call them. So we set up the hotline, but we didn't sit around waiting for the phone to ring. We made calls to our businesses. So we did the first round, launched on April 8th, so just a couple weeks after the pandemic had started. We called 755 businesses. So for reference, we have about 1,000 businesses on our business license list, but that includes apartment buildings and that sort of thing. So we called the businesses that operate as businesses in our community and really focused in on those that were owned and operated by people from Quesnel, and those that we perceived were hit the hardest. Got multiple follow-up phone calls to make sure we connected with someone. We completed 220 intake forms. So some businesses we're doing great. If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, grocery stores weren't hurting, RV store, people selling RVs were doing just fine. So some businesses were just happy to have the phone call. They appreciated that, but they didn't go through the full questionnaire. We made 113 referrals in that first round. And then in the second round, we followed up with that 220 number to see how they had done with the programs that we had pointed them towards. And we found that those businesses had accessed on average almost $19,000. And we extrapolated that to calculate that we had about $4.1 million coming into the community through our hotline. So this is just showcasing our team from all of the different organizations that participated. A few details. We did have a confidentiality agreement that we put together right from the beginning. We used a VoIP phone system so that we could have one phone number and at least two people managing incoming calls at any time during business hours. And we could all then use the same phone system working from home. We also used BC business counts, which I'm sure Laith will tell you about during the business retention and expansion session. That allows you to set up your surveys, do all of your intakes, keep all your data in one place, and then generate reports in a number of different ways. So that was really helpful. We use Zoom for check-ins with our team once a week, and we use Google Drive to have a master resource list and keep that up to date with all of the different programs as they came out and as they changed over time. We did a third round of calls in December 2020 through to the spring of 2021. This time really focusing on locally owned and operated businesses, as well as our nonprofit organizations. And at that time, there was the $30,000 available through the BC government for small and medium businesses. And so we focused on that first. It was really sort of a triage approach. If you were eligible for that, that's what we got you signing up for. If you weren't eligible for that, then we started going through to see how else you could be supported. Some of the keys to our success were strong relationships. Like I said, we'd all worked together a number of times before. I think if you're new in your role and you don't know who the manager is of your community futures, or you haven't met the Chamber of Commerce, you're not sure who the BIA is, get out, maybe meet for coffee now, get to know each other before a crisis hits. Like Colleen and Dale both said, it's not if, it's when there'll be a crisis in the future. We were really lucky. We had some funding with some wiggle room, so we were able to pay for all of our costs with that. In an ideal world, I would love to have a budget line item that was for emergencies only kind of thing, that we could access if we needed it. Fortunately or unfortunately, we had crisis experience. We had been through mill closures, we'd been through wildfires together. And so we knew exactly who we needed to call and who we needed to bring together and what would work for us really quickly. And then lastly, I think it was really important that we stuck to the scope. We had a number of different partners, and all of those partners have other objectives. I don't think we could have called as many businesses as we did, as quickly as we did, if the BIA was also trying to recruit board members and the Chamber was trying to recruit members. We were sticking to our objective of maximizing the financial supports to our business community. And some lessons learned. We didn't do everything perfectly, that's for sure. It's really important, I think, always to work with your team member strengths. Not everybody is great at cold calling businesses. That doesn't mean that they can't contribute in other ways. There's news releases to write, reports to generate, promotions to do of the program. So really work with the strengths of the people on the team. Creating a question flow, that was something that we really got right by that third round, where if yes to this, then you can skip to this question. You don't have to ask every single question to every single business. Having a local phone number, I think, is really important. We had a 1-800 number and we were calling businesses. And I don't know about you, but when a 1-800 number calls me, I don't answer it. So that was something that we definitely learned and would do differently next time would be to make sure that we had one central local phone number. And last, I think it's really important to celebrate the good news. We, in any disaster or any crisis situation, when you're calling businesses, they're stressed out, and some of them will share horrible stories with you and put all of their stresses onto you. And that's really hard as somebody on the other end of the phone line. So it was really important when we had those weekly calls each week that we recognized the hard work that everybody was doing, that we also recognized the businesses that were calling and were thanking us for making these phone calls, and recognizing the progress we were making through our list. So I think that's it for me, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer if we have time for that. I'll turn it back over to Dale and Colleen.
You have so many good points in there, Amy. I was just cheering away as you're giving some of your lessons learned and things that you've done. You know, I love the just even the small little things. Like if you don't know your partners in your community now, it's difficult to build that relationship after a disaster hits. So yeah, I love that you said get out and get to know them now. And I would echo that same with your businesses. Get out now and get to know your businesses before a disaster versus after a disaster. And you know, one thing I love, and Dale, I say this all the time, we can talk for hours and hours and days on business retention and expansion and the benefit of it. But what it really showed is how you were able to capture such hard numbers and really be accountable for what you did, whether it was using BC Counts or maybe it's another system for other people. But there's nothing else, especially in a smaller community, that allows you to collect that data that is so true and real for your community.
Yeah, exactly. And I, you know, the other thing you said, Amy, that kind of hit, you said it right at the beginning, was that, you know, the businesses don't like asking for help. And you're right. And Colleen, how many times have we gone to another community and we hear, you know, perfect example is our businesses haven't been impacted, or we can't talk to our businesses. And the reality is, as a local government, you can talk to your businesses. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from talking to your businesses. It doesn't say that under the municipal charter, and we actually, and I was talking to Ashley as Amy was talking, that we actually have something written up on what you can do under the municipal charter, and we're going to quickly revise the local leaders manual and actually add that as an appendix, because it's sometimes, you know, communities do think you can't. And I think Amy's example is perfect. And not only did they talk to businesses, they stored the information and they used so many community partners. And yes, you know, like there's so many ways to do things, and you can't just always do it on your own. And it's that whole idea of partnerships as well. So Amy, thank you so much for and I guess to continue on what I said about the, you know, what we've heard in so many communities is that our businesses haven't been impacted. And then when we go out to the businesses, we find $30 million in economic impact by these businesses. And some of them have hired back their staff, and some have been shut down for 2 to 3 weeks. And some, you know, like there is an economic impact. And if they can't find labor because their labor is evacuated to another community, that's an economic impact. So we need to address those types of things. So.
Dale, if I could just mention, can I just mention 2 quick things?
Yeah.
Just one that I think was mentioned earlier around duplication of efforts, and you don't want to have that. And I think that was one of our purposes in calling everybody together really early on. And because we already had that prior relationship, there was the trust there that we could work together, and you know, one party wasn't going to take credit for the whole thing. We were all working together, and it was a partnership, and so that was really important. And the other thing, just a little bit unrelated to the disaster, but when we did go out and talk to businesses after our mill closure in 2014, sometimes you hear really surprising things. So yes, so, you shouldn't assume that your businesses aren't impacted, but we assumed that our industrial businesses were badly impacted after Canfor closed in Quesnel in 2014. And when we went out and talked to the businesses on 2 Mile Flat, we were prepared for doom and gloom. And what we heard was, well, that was the best mill to close because they didn't buy anything in Quesnel. They brought all their services in from Prince George. So that turned into a good news story that we could share out about what was happening in the community and what the real impact of the mill closure was.
Really good point too. So okay, thank you very much, Amy. And we do have, and I'm hoping this is okay, Amy, because I did not ask you, but we did include your contact information in our last slide, so that if anybody had any questions, that they could reach out to you. So thanks again. Okay. Colleen?
Yeah,
We have,
and the other good point.
We have 19 minutes. Anyway, yes.
19, okay, so really quick. But the other good point that Amy made, and we don't address it here, and we should, Dale, is that health and wellness aspect. Amy mentioned that when you do talk to businesses, you do hear a lot of stories that are sad, that are heart-wrenching at times, and it's hard as volunteers or as EDOs to listen to these stories, and that's something that does need to be reflected back in your plan as to how you're going to help with that.
Yeah, and exactly, a good comment, Colleen. And if you remember, when we were working in one of the communities impacted by the floods, it got brought to our attention by some of the businesses, a number of the businesses actually, about the need for some mental health support. And so we were able to, and we would encourage communities to include this in their plans. Are those contact information for the BC government actually has a mental health support program with the Ministry of Health that can come in and actually work with individual businesses and their employees, and so would encourage people to add that. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. Colleen?
Yeah. Absolutely. So another step we'd like you to look at when you're doing your planning is the business reentry part, and that's really about getting businesses back into the community. And what we have found with disasters, and once the disaster is sort of in quotation marks gone through the community, if you will, but the floodings receded and that sort of thing, that normally what happens is that the doors are just flung open and everybody comes back into the community, and the challenge with that is we know that when residents come back into the community after a disaster, what we really want is to feel that level of normalcy as quickly as possible. And what that usually means, or generally means for us, is that we want to go and have a cup of coffee at the coffee shop. We want to go and get some gas. We want to go and get our groceries at the local shop. And so if we just open the doors to everybody right away, what will happen is the business owner of the grocery store or the coffee shop, who's also a resident, hasn't had time to get their supplies in, hasn't had time to get their labor force back in, hasn't had time to do any of those things to help it make it feel a bit normal for the rest of us residents and citizens. So if we could put together a business reentry program, that would be great. We again, yeah, you're right, Dale, time is crazy, as we always do. But here's, sort of what we're suggesting in the system that sort of works is, that tier 1, those are those agencies or groups that are involved in the emergency response. They're the initial ones in. Then to the relief and service providers, those food, the gas stations, et cetera, et cetera. Let them get up and running so that there is that normalcy starting to be created, and then open access to everybody. But again, we've got templates for that all in BCEDA's manuals.
Great, thank you. And then we need to make sure that, again, and I think Amy really emphasize this really well, is the use of the partners, and you need to do that through capacity building, and it isn't just you being able to continue operations, and maybe if you can't, maybe you've partnered with the chamber or the community futures office or somebody else in the community or in a neighboring community to be able to continue those operations. You're not in this on your own, and so it's important to pull in those other partners to help build those databases, to build the number of resources that you can make available to the businesses, and to be able to share the information that you're able to gather. And then of course to create that communication strategy as to how you're going to let your businesses and the community know about what you're doing to help rebuild the economy. And it's important not only after but during the disaster that you're doing this, so that, like as Colleen talked about, the reentry plan, that businesses are aware as to when they're going to be able to be allowed in, to make sure that they've thrown away rotten food, filled those empty fuel tanks for the gas stations to fill those, or to restock the restaurants with fresh food and etc. So it's important to have good communications networks and have the capacity within your organizations to be able to do that.
Yeah, the workforce and training, boy, we have definitely seen an impact in the labor force in disasters, and one of the challenges that we've certainly seen is the length of that recovery time. So many businesses are not able to open their doors again for weeks at a time, months at a time, and even beyond. So what happens to that labor force that they did have? What we do see, unfortunately, is a lot of those individuals, maybe not by choice, but they have to leave the community to find employment somewhere else. And a lot of times those individuals do not return to the community. So your local employers are then left 6 months down the road, when they are able to open, looking to find out how are they going to fill those positions again. And there definitely is a need for finding what that challenge is for local businesses should that happen. The business retention and expansion program that we hope you all have operating now can help you with that information at some point for the future, if you collect that information now. Also, you need to start to think about the housing solution. So when residents, because we are talking about the economic recovery, of course, we're focused on businesses, but of course those business owners and the labor force are living in your community, so they're impacted twice in sometimes, right? Their business has been, let's use floods as an example. Their business has been flooded, but so is their home. So what are the housing solutions that you can consider pre-planning in your plan now? Are there something that you can identify as an initiative or strategy in the pre-planning that would help alleviate housing solutions, or help not alleviate, but help to identify housing solutions in the case of a disaster for those displaced workers as well as the business owners? And that's why it's so important, of course, to work with the workforce agencies in your community, the universities, the post-education colleges. All of those ones need to come into play for workforce, for the training that may be needed after a disaster, because the business may need to pivot. We saw that an awful lot with COVID as things changed. Labor force needs changed. The training needs changed for local businesses. So there's lots of things to consider. And I'll just wrap up quickly with the transportation side of things. What we found is some communities were able to be a bit resourceful, and were able to pull together with major employers a bus system where the employers were not, or the employees may not be able to reside in the community for a time and had to go to neighboring communities, but larger employers were able to sort of pull together and say, let's build a bus network, if you will, a private bus network, if you will, to bring the employees back in. so that they have this. So think of the transportation sort of aspects of getting your labor force in and out as well.
Yeah, I think that housing part, Colleen, is something that we've just seen as such a huge issue that, of course, does impact that workforce and training piece. How many times from a flood event did we talk to businesses that their employees were in another community and hadn't returned to work because they didn't have the transportation, and we don't have temporary housing. We don't have a system to establish temporary housing in these communities. I mean, if you look at Lytton or Grand Forks, even when they were evacuated, you look at Princeton, Merritt, those areas when people were evacuated, where do we house them again? We already had a housing crunch, and then this just made it worse, right? So we need to have the ability to set up some temporary housing shelters for people to be able to stay, sort of like what we'd seen when we were out in High River. When we were working out there. So on the policy side of things, encourage you quickly here to look at what can you do to speed up the process for approvals for different projects, or for the rebuilding of a house, or the rebuilding of a business that may have been destroyed or somewhat impacted by the flood or the fire or some other type of disaster that may have come in. Make sure you're reviewing those policies now. Do you have clauses in place that go, in the event of a disaster, this can happen or that can happen, or the need to pay, or the need to, whatever it is you want to do, make sure that you have some sort of a policy in place right off the start, so that you're not waiting for council to be able to get together to adopt any policy changes that might need to take place. Waste disposal, we've seen that in communities. Where do we get rid of the waste? And then of course, maybe the existing building specifications may not meet today's needs. How are you going to manage those types of situations? So where some construction or some development is now been damaged beyond what sort of it can be rebuilt, it has to be built under the new standards. So making sure that information is all readily available.
Yeah, and it's so much easier to do it pre-disaster than it is to do it during a disaster. Although I will say, how many communities successfully put new policies or amended policies very quickly to address some of the business needs, and I definitely commend local governments for that.
Sure. And under business financing, again, you need to be aware, most financial institutions will have a policy around, waiving of interest rates, or waiving of principal payments, or maybe it's waiving of payments altogether, or most financial institutions will have those. So talk to your financial institutions ahead of time and ask, what would their response be if X happened, and find out what that is. I think, we've seen some great examples even in Grand Forks, Colleen, with how CIBC managed to bring in support. They were the business bank in town along with the credit union, and they were able to share with the credit union for a while until they brought in a portable bank, sort of like a food truck bank, if you will, that came into the community where their businesses could drop off deposits and things to keep the banking side of things open. Where can lending take place? Do you have the community futures organization? Do they have capacity to do lending of some sort? The community futures were really key in some of the disaster response and getting businesses back up and running after the 2017 and other wildfires that happened. And then of course there's the Red Cross, and the Red Cross, we worked with the Red Cross to establish financial supports for in particular, so many of the different programs. But we want to make sure that if anybody's on the line and from flood impacted communities, that funding, as Ashley's put into the chat, has been extended to November 30th, where businesses can apply for some financial support from the Canadian Red Cross. And depending on how that process all works, maybe there'll be a phase 2, but right now it's in phase 1 of getting some financial support out to businesses to help them offset some of their losses. It's a fairly easy process.
Communication strategy, that is going to be a key component of your economic disaster plan that you're going to put together. Communication is certainly compromised, not only during, but definitely after a disaster, for sure. There needs to be that individual who is going to be designated as the one person who speaks for the economic recovery of the community. Unfortunately, there's too many times we've seen where there is mixed messages because one agency is talking about it, another agency is talking about it, another agency might be talking about it, but they're not on the same page. They're not giving the same message. So in your plan, when you start to talk about how your communication strategy and what that's going to look like, make sure you designate that one key person who's going to be responsible for all of that media sort of coverage and that key messaging, and what that key messaging is definitely going to be. And by doing that, you are going to help mitigate that misinformation. I'm not going to say that you're going to get rid of it. There will always be misinformation around, and rumors and hearsay and bad information information that's been misinterpreted. But you can at least sort of help to manage and lessen that misinformation as much as possible by having that one key spokesperson to do the messaging there, and also make sure in your communication strategy you talk about where the businesses in particular can access the help that they're going to need for their economic recovery, and be that through your office's economic development, be that through the economic recovery center, through the task force that you have. Just identify all of these things so that, again, once that disaster happens, you're able to pull out the communication section of that plan and just hit the ground running and getting the keynotes out there as fast as possible and help your businesses recover as fast as possible.
So in the short, recovery will be led by local governments. When disasters happen in our communities, we have a tendency to go, what's the federal government going to do? What's the provincial government going to do? But what are we going to do? We have to take the lead in making sure that, that if something happened in our community, how are we going to rebuild? How are we going to make sure our businesses come back? Or how are we going to make sure our businesses survive, or the workforce is going to come back? It's really got to be led by local governments. I'm not saying it has to be paid by local governments, but the process needs to be led by local governments. And I think that you really need to look at how can you be creative? What kind of new things can you do as communities that will help lead that economic recovery? It's not just the same old way of doing economic development when you're in that recovery mode. We need to make sure that we're being creative. And I think, COVID was a phenomenal example of how communities adapted in so many ways to make sure that the economy and not just came back to where it was, but actually, exceeded that. And by being flexible in policies, being flexible in how things were being done in the community, and not just that stringent way of saying, no, you can't do this, but saying we can do this and make those necessary changes. Colleen,
Yeah, there were
else
so
you
many
want?
best practices that came out from COVID of what local governments, creatively did and allowed in their community. And one example, just really quickly, would be being able to drink on our beaches, right, in a responsible way. But they were able to put that through where without COVID, that would, I bet you, years away. Or the extension of those patios, right? That communities were able to turn around. And what I love is that so many of these communities have seen the benefits of some of these new programs and policies and have kept them in place and are committed to keeping them in place.
I think that the patio one, Colleen, it's amazing to me that we fast tracked the approvals of those patios, or we just allowed businesses to do it. And then there were some communities that said, hey, we're going to come and build them for you. so that people
Yes.
could have outside seating, or took some of that parking requirement that maybe was needed and said, hey, you can put the patio there to meet the needs of those. And then again, like you said, well, just continue to allow it because it works. It creates more economic factor, more things that happen, more money is being spent, people are out more and on the streets more doing things in a positive way, and that's great. So some key points that we want to close with: communities are not prepared to rebuild an economy after a disaster, and we really need to be better prepared at doing that. It does take a team. It isn't going to be one individual in the community or the province or the federal government that's going to change things. It takes a team of people working together to rebuild that economy after a disaster and in the process of planning for that recovery. It is easier if you're prepared, and the reality is, just like any other plan, it's plan. And I would encourage those communities that maybe are in the process of actually doing a new economic development strategy, is to look at the strategies and encourage your consultants to build in some of these key things to make sure that they're being implemented as part of your economic development plan, to make sure that they're putting together, key recommendations to help lead towards the development of this plan should a disaster ever strike. These are some of the resources that are available on our website. I believe Ashley has put some links in the chat box. Those are two different documents. The one document on the left is a document that has some templates related to some of the areas that we talked about in today's session, that helps you walk through the steps of preparing that piece of the plan. And the other one just talks about all of this in a much broader context, and is a newly released document that we just released over the last few months. So we do full day workshops on preparing your community or region for a disaster. These are specifically related to creating your plan, and we do exercises to sort of help you walk through the process of developing your plan. And those are available from BCEDA, and if you want more information, you can email about that. And I think that's it. These are our next upcoming workshops. Our next week we have the business retention and expansion. We have economic development ethics, neighborhood and neighborhood development. So those are all next week, and we hope you'll be able to join us. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, Colleen, or I'm not sure what happened to Amy's, but we'll put Amy's email address in the chat box here. And we appreciate you all participating today. Thanks very much, everyone.